Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Praful Bidwai Memorial Committee, I'd like to thank you all for being here for our first Praful Bidwai Memorial event. Today is exactly 1 year since our friend and colleague left us, still mourned and missed by so very many whose lives he was such an affectionate and cherished part of. We're especially happy that his sister Meera is here with us, and I want to thank you, Meera, for coming. This 1 year has been quite eventful. The year that Praful has been out of our lives, marked first by the publication of his big book, The Phoenix Moment, Challenges Confronting the Indian Left, of which I think there may be a couple of copies on the table at the back. It's a big book, as I said. It's been extremely well received, and many tributes and meetings have been organized for Praful and for the book in many parts of the country by those with whom he worked on the issues dear to his heart and dear to his politics. The Memorial Committee is made up of some of Praful's close friends, associates and family, and includes the Netherlands-based Transnational Institute, of which Praful was a fellow of long-standing and great respect. The Memorial Award is one of the committee's initiatives, and the award money has been raised through donations and generous gifts made by several individuals and organizations. We would like to express our deep appreciation to all those who gave so spontaneously, and I might add, happily. We hope to be able to sustain the award for a good long while through this continuing support. As many of you know, Praful had a very large and very rare archive of documents and books and diverse materials on all the issues he was concerned with: the environment and climate change, social movements, the Indian left, nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, the economy, and a very few works of fiction. His library and all his documents have been donated to Ashoka University in Sonipat. They responded immediately and positively to our suggestion that the university house this collection, and were happy to receive it. We hope very much that students, scholars and faculty will make full use of this very rich, very unusual archive. Achin Banai, Subrat Raju and Harsh Kapoor, as a sort of extension of Praful's work, have put together an anthology of all his writing on nuclear energy, and it has been published by the CNDP, an organization with which Praful was associated for a very long time. It's called Nuclear Matters, Civil and Military, and copies are available here for anyone who would like to take one. The books are not priced, but there is a donation box right next to them that will be happy to take whatever you'd like to give it. I'd like now to invite Romila Thapar to please begin this evening's, what should I call it, memorial.
Where should I begin? How does one begin to remember somebody whom one was very friendly with and admired greatly? He was a friend of many years. We didn't meet too frequently, but off and on. And as Ritu said quite rightly, there's so much that's happened in this past year And there have been so many occasions where one has thought, oh, Praful should have been around because he would have written a column and he would have raised all kinds of issues. He was the kind of person who would, undaunted, write about the issues that needed to be raised. So we all miss him enormously, and remember our many, many conversations with him. And I remember very animated conversations which would very often begin by Praful saying, "Did you know that?" And then one would say, "No, but let me tell you." And then one would say, "Well, Praful, maybe you're right, maybe you're exaggerating a bit." No, I'll tell you the facts. Now you sit down and I will tell you the facts. And so one sat down and Praful told one the facts. And it was all done not in a kind of pedantic or superior way that I know and I'm telling you kind of thing, but it was all done very much in the manner that led to more questions and more explorations, and more of, shall we think of this or shall we think of that or something. And I must say that I miss that enormously, because there are not too many people who are constantly reaching out into different areas, making interconnections or loosening connections that exist. I mean, I learned, for example, whatever I learned more or less about nuclear energy, I learned during evenings when we would gather in the homes of friends and Praful would hold forth. And he would have his views and people would argue with him, and through these arguments, sometimes shouting arguments, one got to learn a great deal about the subject that was being talked about. He began, of course, as we all know, all his friends know, he began as a journalist, writing in a variety of papers, and some of the Indian papers he wrote for were Economic and Political Weekly and the Times of India, which he did do for a lengthy period. And then he also wrote for papers outside India, like The Guardian, or in France, Le Monde. So he had a very wide coverage of readers. And I used to always look forward enormously to his column in Frontline, because one never knew what it was going to be on. This was always a surprise. Praful would always have a new idea and a new way of approaching that idea, and then this would be worked out in the column. And when he was really hepped up, really worked up about things, and felt that he must say it in more than one column, then you had a series of 3 or 4 columns following each other roughly around a subject. Climate change was one of those on which there was certainly more than one column. But writing columns is not all that he did, as we know. He also wrote books, and he did a lot of work and other activities. As a peace activist, he was deeply involved in matters concerning nuclear energy, nuclear power, how to keep it under control. He realized the fact that like many people did and wrote about it and so on, that this was really plagued with something that could be quite disastrous. And his initial interest, which goes back 20-25 years, continued all along with many of the columns that he wrote, and continued in his the books, the essays he put together, and some of them are in this book that has just come out. And as we all know, this is a subject that is very much with us. In fact, this very week, we are going to be talking about this at great length in the newspapers. And it's a frightening subject, by any accounts. It's a really frightening subject. What are we playing with? What are people playing with? And when you think of the kind of people that are going to be taking these decisions, it becomes even more frightening. But there was that, and he talked about that. Climate change was something else. At the time he started talking about climate change, when people said, "Arey, he's exaggerating, it's not as bad as all that, and this thing will pass, we've had climate changes in the past," and so on. But he was very persistent, and it's a persistence which today one realizes is an extremely urgent matter, that you cannot say this is something that will pass. It won't pass. We may pass, but climate change will have a very, very deep effect. And in some ways, his writing was really pioneering the subject of climate change, which was so important. On the Indian scene, the concerns that he had were concerns that many of us had, but he had them with great vigor and commitment. The rising tide of communalism, which worried him enormously, worried all of us, but he was really very deeply concerned about it. And I recall many conversations with him about this, and with friends like Achin, about, in fact, the importance of secularism, not just as secularism per se, but the fact that you cannot have a fully functional democratic system unless it's secular. That these two are bedfellows, twins, or whatever it is that you want to call it, which are very, very close. One needs the other, and you cannot have a proper democracy without, in fact, a secular element, a strong secular element controlling that democracy. And in the Indian situation, it was particularly necessary, as we all know that what is happening today, what happened yesterday, what might happen tomorrow, is deeply connected with the question of how secular can we make the democracy so that it functions. And alongside all of this, carrying on quietly, was of course his great interest in the left and the future of the left. And as the left kind of bumbled from one thing to the next, Praful would get absolutely mad and say, why can't they work things out in a better way? And what was his concern? I would say that his deep and constant concern was that given the increasing centrality of neoliberalism and communalism, and the two very often go together, and certainly in the Indian case they are closely tied, that given this increase, what will happen to even the future of democracy in this country? And this, in a sense, is partly, not entirely, but partly what motivated him into working on the Phoenix movement. And many discussions that we had about it. It was not just the left, not the left movement in itself, in isolation, as a movement that somehow didn't need a base, or what was the base it needed. It was the totality of that movement in terms of what was going to happen to the future of democracy. And the book turned out to be, in fact, exactly the book that many of us had been waiting for. Partly that we had had discussions with him, and partly that we weren't quite sure which way it would go, but I remember when I read the proofs of the book, I just was absolutely thrilled, because I said at last, it's a book that needed to be written, that has been written, and let's hope it's going to be widely discussed. It is an analysis of what led to the inevitable question of where does the left go from here, given the fact that there is a decline coming into the condition of the left. Where does it go from here? This is a very fundamental question which many of us still ask and talk about and find no answers to. And how can left movements, in turn, encourage a secular democracy? That is one thing that the left could do. That's one thing that the left should have done to a much greater extent than it did. And I do hold my generation responsible for a lot of the weakness in that position, that one didn't push it hard enough. But what might be the alternate movements to seeing the left, other than seeing it purely conventionally as either participating in a parliamentary system or at the other extreme, activities like the Maoist activities in central India today? The left, he always argued, is essential to Indian democracy. And it was this, in a sense, which made it absolutely necessary to go into the question of what does the left do now in the present situation. We had quite a few conversations about this before, while in the course of what he was writing, in the course of his writing the book, about the past, of course, reminiscing, and quite a bit about which way it might go and what the future direction might be. Some of these conversations now come back to me very powerfully. For example, his fear that the increase of communalism would lead to an Indian version of McCarthyism. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we are fearing in our daily life these days. You pick up the newspaper, and before you open it, you think, who and why? And then proceed to read it. And there is that element, that feel of, you know, if I write something or I say something, how is it going to be taken and what is going to be the reaction? And the other very major question that comes right through the book and that came through in all the conversations that we had, many of us, the tussle between the systems that the left could adopt. What are the alternate systems? Have we really discussed these in detail? And in a sense, we haven't. We've rather taken it for granted that because we were a parliamentary system, there was no other alternate system which could help us in establishing movements connected with the left. But there are alternate systems, and that is something that we need to do. Now, the alternate systems then require rethinking the Indian reality. There has been a tendency, I think, maybe again it is a tendency that belongs to my generation, and those subsequent to my generation don't feel this way and are much more activated. But there has been a tendency really of taking things as they come and not really settling down to saying we have to fundamentally rethink the Indian reality. I'm thinking of the kinds of even simple questions that come up in conversations like, do we focus on urban movements in the belief that the rest will catch up with these movements, that the urban movements will become the pace setters? Or do we make it a point to comprehend what is happening in rural India? Not that one is making a sharp dichotomy between the two, but there is a difference, and that difference has to be understood. Adding a little more perhaps to what has always been taken as the program of the left movement, which is land reform. Yes, land reform is extremely important, but as we now think back of the governments that have existed with a left orientation, we say, what about the other things? What about the other things that are terribly important just to citizenship and human rights, like food and water, like education, like health, like social justice? What happened to all of that? Why didn't that come into the pictures? Changes are happening in any case, in spite of ourselves. But can the left movements give any direction to these changes and make them much more positive than they are? I'm not sure. To conclude, I'm not sure how Praful would have reacted to this question, but I think he would have been deeply interested in discussing it. And I haven't the slightest doubt that he would, had he been here this evening, thoroughly enjoyed the proceedings of this evening in terms of exploring and discussing alternative ways. And more so, the direction which some people on the left are taking and which we are going to be exposed to and which will be explained later in the course of the evening. And I think that the alternative that is going to be presented is an alternative that we need to think of extremely seriously. In terms of, again, let me repeat, making changes, giving a direction. What is the kind of direction that we can even give to ourselves in trying to understand the reality of the country? And it's a direction that we are, in fact, celebrating this evening. One of the directions that is involved in the award is a direction that we are celebrating. And I hope that Praful would have approved of this. I think he would have approved of it very much so. That's all I have to say. May I